The German populace was deeply disconcerted by the developments of 1939, as the government probably was also. We soldiers, who knew the true face of war from the stories told us by our fathers, were certainly not enthused about the prospect of an early hero's death. We were, however, prepared to do our bitter duty. By the middle of July 1939, all of our units were at the sort of high personnel strength that we had previously only seen during mobilization exercises. Everything went along in a smooth and well-organized fashion, like a well-oiled machine. No one spoke of a looming war, and secretly each of us hoped that the whole process would run its course as it all had before. In the beginning of August, our 2nd Battalion Infantry Regiment 3 conducted a fortification exercise along the Polish border. We built positions for use in the event of a possible altercation with Poland. It appeared to me that measures were being taken to avoid leaving married soldiers, particularly those with children, in combat positions. As my company was departing our garrison, I was transferred to a newly organized Divisional Replacement Battalion, Field Replacement Battalion 21. The departure from my 9th Company comrades, with whom I had spent many years, was not easy. I attempted to return to my old gang as a replacement during the first days of the war in Poland, but was foiled. The Field Replacement Battalion was stationed in the East Prussian town of Morungen, as was the headquarters of 3rd Army. I saw that the signs around the barracks simply read, Exercise Army, 3rd Command. The 3rd Army's commanding general was our old commander, General der Artillerie Georg von Kuchler. The nucleus of this army was composed of the 3 original East Prussian infantry divisions. The 3rd Army only had 8 infantry divisions, the 4th Panzer Brigade, and the only horse cavalry brigade in the German Wehrmacht. The 3rd Army was also one of the smallest field armies to participate in the Polish campaign. The 10th Army, in comparison, boasted 18 divisions, including 2 panzer and 2 motorized divisions. Upon arriving in Morungen, I reported to the Stabsfeldwebel of the replacement company to which I had been assigned. He was a nice older man nearing the completion of his 24th year of service, one of the rare 24 pointers. He had only made it that far because he had been assigned to the regimental band. Now this old Stabsfeldwebel had been assigned as our first sergeant. Unfortunately, he would later be killed in a pointless attack in the Maginot Line. In short order, after assembling in Morungen, the Field Replacement Battalion outfitted and equipped the arriving reservists. Immediately thereafter, the battalion was entrained and transported to join the rest of the 21st Infantry Division, already in their assembly areas near the Polish border in the vicinity of Graudenz. As an older NCO, I was henceforth sent back to our East Prussian garrison town, where over a decade ago I had endured my recruit training. Osterode was a town of about 16,000 inhabitants, and our adjacent garrison held about 1,000 soldiers. Despite our modest pay, our presence was always an important factor in the economy of this small city. Except for occasional unseemly incidents, and by today's standards, even these incidents were harmless affairs, such as minor fistfights, all businesses welcomed soldiers within their walls. Businesses which provided diversions or entertainment for the troops during their free time were naturally an important part of the economic community of each garrison town. During my time there from 1928 to 1939, Osterode had 2 movie theatres, 3 dance cafes, a good dozen cosy and friendly taverns, and many excellent guest-house restaurants. There were a great many things for soldiers to do in and around Osterode. Our favourite activities included eating, drinking, dancing, taking part in different sporting activities, or travelling about the beautiful East Prussian countryside by boat or by railroad. Every weekend there were dances held in 3 large halls in town, although one could also choose to go to a private club, either the type to which one needed a bona fide invitation, or one at which one could pay to enter. Cultural activities were not especially favoured by young infantrymen. Of course, the deciding factor regarding our off-duty endeavours was always the same: money. 5 marks was generally enough for an evening. To get into the mood to go to a dance hall, for example, one had to have the means to purchase the necessary potions. A little beer and maybe a shot of rye whiskey were usually enough to dispel any hesitation. The bottle of beer cost 25 pfennigs in a tavern, cognac cost 20, and a shot of clear whiskey was 10 pfennigs. Once fortified, we would make our way to the close combat ball. Once at the objective, a dance hall, one had to carefully protect one's remaining resources, as the entry fees were usually about 3 marks. To remain in the place, one must always have a drink in front of him, so we had to use our soldierly initiative to find ways of staying. There was usually a long bar in the room adjacent to the dance hall, and this is where the poorest among us could be found. Grizzled veterans of the First World War made the best companions here, as they would happily refresh our drinks while regaling us with stories of their heroic deeds at Verdun or on the Somme. A truly virtuoso sponge could extend this act for hours by reacting with expressions of wonderment and astonishment as these old boys spun their tales. In the end, however, it often took equal imagination to pry oneself away from these beneficent old men. Usually, conjuring the illusion of bodily needs was the answer. It is well known that our East Prussian girls were beautiful, and the population generally also retained a positive attitude about the soldiery. In fact, among most of the girls, military service was a large part of the measure of a man, and was expected. Nevertheless, the situation in Osterode was complicated. It was not simple for the girls of a town of its size to remain respectable around a population of 1,000 predominantly single young men. This was especially so for nice girls, who had to contend with many young men who were less than completely serious in their ultimate intentions. The selection of the right partner required a profound knowledge of the psyche of post-pubescent infantrymen. However, it seemed that this knowledge was passed on to the girls of every old garrison town through their mother's milk, as many of their female antecedents had confronted precisely the same challenges for generations before. Further, most girls knew that most troops were not likely to keep their mouths shut once they got back to the barracks, and that they would promptly announce the news of their successes to their barrack mates the next morning. Thus, most young infantrymen didn't stand a chance of satisfying their blooming passions with a nice girl in Osterode. This did not mean that the citizens or girls of Osterode had anything against a long-term attachment to a career soldier, and we were all career soldiers in the Reichswehr. Indeed, quite the opposite was true. Since most 12-pointers went on to have respectable careers in civil service, marriage to one of us was generally welcomed by the families of our garrison town. Like many East Prussian towns, Osterode lay beside a large lake. In the lower quarter of the city, there was an esplanade which on holidays would be decorated with garlands of lanterns a kilometre long. There was also a pier with docks for small passenger ships, on which one could make excursions. Many of our East Prussian lakes were connected by canals, so travel to many destinations was easy. In the early 1930s, our battalion founded a water sports club, from which one could obtain the use of a canoe or rowboat. In the summer months, these boats were in more or less constant usage during off-duty hours, mostly to chauffeur our girlfriends around to quiet inlets or small rush-covered islands. In the late summer of 1939, however, these idylls were rapidly becoming a thing of the seemingly distant past. It was the last days of August, 1939. I had once read that the summer days before the beginning of the First World War were especially beautiful, as if nature was presenting her greatest splendour just before the dying began. Now, 25 years later, one could have written the same thing. Each summer day was more magnificent than the last. On the evening of the 25th of August, our company commander opined that X-hour was imminent. Only much later did we find out why the operation was delayed, and the units already on the way to their objectives pulled back. Feverish, last-minute diplomatic manoeuvres to avert war were taking place. By the 31st of August, however, von Ribbentrop declared that he no longer had authority to negotiate. The dice had been thrown. Situation White went into effect. The order to execute, which had already come down from the highest command authorities in the late afternoon, was brief. Missions and objectives remained the same. X-Day, the 1st of September 1939. X-hour, 4:45 a.m. As I opened the window in my barracks at 5 a.m., I heard an endless peal of thunder from the south. The artillery on the Polish border had opened fire. I was dumbstruck. My childhood memories of the First World War were still very distinct. I hurried into the barracks square to find someone with whom to talk. There stood the former commander of our 11th Company, Major von T., now in the uniform of a General Staff Officer, and the IAA of our division, two surrounded by soldiers and besieged with questions. "Yes," he said with a shrug, "this time the shooting is for real." It was exactly 9 months before the previously longed-for conclusion of my term as a 12-pointer. It was well that neither the German people nor we soldiers knew how long this war would last, or how it would end almost 6 years later. On the 1st of September 1939, an epoch began that would change the face of Europe and our history. The Second World War had begun. The Field Replacement Battalion was alerted at 8 a.m. because Polish troops were allegedly preparing to cross the river Weichsel near the ferry at Kurzebrak, and also to the south of it. Marienwerder is situated barely 4 kilometers from the Weichsel, which at that point measures almost 500 meters across. Presumably, the riverbank opposite the Polish corridor was at that time only lightly occupied by border patrols, and for some reason or other the patrols panicked, as happens often at the beginning of a war. First, however, we moved into position on the plateaus west of Marienwerder and started to dig in. We dug in vain, and even refilled the holes on the same afternoon. False alarm. A few hours into the attack, the Poles already had other problems than crossing the Weichsel towards us. From the early morning hours, almost like a shuttle, squadrons of German bombers flew back and forth over the Polish border to the south. By then, the Polish Marshal Edward Ridsmigli presumably understood that his march towards Berlin was not going to happen. At this hour, the bulk of the Polish Air Force had already been destroyed on the ground. 3. On the 4th of September, our division had already entered the outskirts of Fortress Graudenz, which was seized on the 5th of September. After this, we were moved to the southeast of the province, and from there turned again towards Poland. The Field Reserve Battalion followed the division across the Narew River between Lomsha and Ostrolenka, and after a few days reached Białystok, our final objective. During the whole Polish campaign, I experienced only one combat episode. South of the Narew, while taking a rest, we were suddenly told that scattered but strong units of Polish troops were approaching from the north of the advancing division. A so-called battle-capable patrol under my command, mounted on bicycles, was sent towards the direction from which the enemy was thought to be coming. We rode several kilometers without detecting anything, until a large meadow with many haystacks aroused my curiosity. I motioned to my infantrymen to check out the haystacks, which they did by poking the straw vigorously with their bayonets. They had remarkable success, and the reason soon became obvious. After a few loud screams, many of the haystacks suddenly became alive. From almost every one, a few battle-weary Polish soldiers crept out, some still with their weapons, but all of whom surrendered without resistance. They had been dispersed from the fortifications on the Narew. Later, during questioning, they stated that more than anything, the attacks of the Stuka dive bombers on their bunkers had undermined their will to fight. In our advance towards Białystok, we passed a place with numerous graves of German soldiers. They all belonged to the same company of a reconnaissance battalion that was probably ambushed right there. On the same day, moving through sand and heath, we were passed by a long convoy. There, in the first car, obviously in a radiant mood, stood the commanding general of Army Group North, Generaloberst Fedor von Bock, who greeted us with his hand raised, crying, "Heil Hitler, my dear comrades." The campaign in Poland was decided in the first 8 days. The last Polish resistance, however, only collapsed on the 1st of October, 4 weeks after the beginning of the war. From a curbside vantage, I later experienced my old company's torchlight triumphant return home to a grateful populace after the conclusion of the campaign in Poland. Unfortunately, there were some dead and wounded to mourn. Right after the Polish campaign, the 21st Infantry Division entrained and was shipped to the Western Front. The destination was the beautiful valley of the Aar River. The Field Replacement Battalion moved into the world-famous spa, Bad Neuenahr, with its many elegant homes and fancy hotels. For us humble East Prussians who came from a flat and rural homeland, This was quite luxurious. Our soldiers learned rather quickly that there are pretty girls not only in East Prussia, but also in the Ahr Valley, although the beauty of the women here was of a different kind. The long presence of Roman legionaries and their influence on many of the tribes in this region were recognizable centuries later. One might have encountered many of these beautiful women and girls in Rome or Paris. In the small establishment situated by the road from Bad Neuenahr to Ahrweiler, I got to know the daughter of the owner, and even fell a bit in love with her. Since a close relationship was out of the question, we developed a platonic friendship. Before I had to return to East Prussia, I introduced a friend of mine, a young reserve officer, to pretty Elsa. Soon after that, they got married, yet regrettably this good friend and comrade fell in one of the last weeks of Weti II. The young widow later on married a gastronome and turned the once modest family business into a quite elegant eatery. In the following years, whenever by chance I got close to Bad Neuenahr, I never missed the opportunity to pay a visit to Elsa and her husband. In any case, upon reaching my newly mobilized unit in East Prussia, Infantry Regiment 371, 161st Infantry Division, I was again transferred to an infantry company, and soon thereafter was reassigned as the leader of the regimental pioneer platoon. The enlisted men and NCOs who were submitted by the individual companies for assignment to this newly raised platoon were supposed to be highly physically fit, and were also supposed to be especially able with their hands. With a few exceptions, however, all that showed up were local militiamen. Protesting this state of affairs was useless. Some really bad cases were exchanged, but with the remainder I had to be content. Later experiences proved this to be only a temporary flaw, because before long I was no longer upset about being shortchanged by the company commanders. I got embarrassed only when we had the first inspection, to almost peacetime standards, which took place under very unfavourable conditions, since the pioneer platoon was stationed in private housing. Later, during the campaign in France, during the few times the platoon was in action, our staffing worked out quite well. Even from the first skirmish, the older men with which the platoon had been furnished kept their cool and fulfilled their duties expertly, which were to clear obstacles and mines. After only a few weeks of training for the 161st Infantry Division at the training centre in Schlagerkrug, near Aris in East Prussia, our regiment was shipped to Zinten. There we moved into the abandoned barracks of the East Prussian 4th Panzer Brigade. Our regimental commander was an elderly reserve oberst of cavalry who had spent some years in China as a military advisor. Even the division commander, General Major Hermann Wilk, was an old Chinese. Both belonged to a team of advisors that had supported Marshal Chiang Kai-shek. This team was already active there during Siecht's time. 5. From time to time, the members of the team would be exchanged, but all were already retired from active duty before they became advisors. On the 2nd of May 1940, we were once again going west to the training centre at Baumholder. This was my third trip across the Reich from frontier to frontier. This was not to be the last either. During the war, I changed fronts 7 times. On the 10th of May, the beginning of the campaign in the west, the 161st Infantry Division marched seemingly without end along the Hunsrück Mountains Road to join the 16th Army as its reserve. Although it was only May, we moved through the Moselle Valley toward Trier in glowing heat without any chance of a cooling breeze. Near Cliserath, we had to get off the highway and temporarily seek quarters in small villages in the wine country. Motorized columns had the right of way. When we began marching again after 3 days, we moved through the beautiful city of Trier, but then we turned north, because the direct road to Luxembourg City was again clogged. We crossed the border near Echternach and marched through this lovely little country up to the French border near Bad Mondorf, where the division took over security missions. Further into the campaign, we were moved westward. It was south of Esch, approaching the Maginot Line, where for the first time we encountered the French opponent. The dark of night can be the attacker's ally, but it is also true that night combat is not one of our soldiers' greatest strengths. A battalion of our infantry regiment 371 advanced toward the edge of a small wood and dug in quite close to the fortifications of the Maginot Line. The French were probably afraid we could knock out their pillboxes in the dark, so they shot harassing and interdictory fire continuously, with machine guns and light artillery through the night. In the early morning hours, they must have expected an attack as they covered the woods with a furious hail of automatic weapons and artillery fire. I had only returned to the regimental command post on the evening before and went to sleep in the pioneer platoon area, expecting no trouble. At dawn, I was suddenly awakened by a small, heavy-set, completely hysterical Unteroffizier, whom I remembered from my battalion in East Prussia. He yelled, "All is lost! The French are coming!" Half-dressed, I ran out to at least organize the defense of our position and to alert everyone. What I found was unearthly silence. The rising sun bathed the peaceful border in amiable light, and far and wide there was no sign of any advancing Frenchmen. As it turned out, the little fat guy was not the only one to run away. The heavy barrage during the night from the Maginot fortresses hitting the forest in which our nearest infantry battalion was deployed made these inexperienced soldiers believe the enemy was already in our midst. This was why several of them panicked and took off aimlessly. With 2 groups of my pioneer platoon, I marched towards the enemy, and a short hour later reached the infantry battalion, which was deployed in the woods. The attack of the French took place only in the fantasies of those who ran away. The whole thing was a quite embarrassing affair. I don't know if division headquarters was ever informed about this, but I guessed that for a good reason it never was. Regrettably, the barrage by the French did inflict some losses on our side. My pioneer platoon suffered 1 man killed. The last serious but also unsuccessful action of the 161st Infantry Division in France took place against the rear and flank of the Maginot Line on the 21st of June 1940 along the Longuillons-Longwy road. There the division outflanked the Maginot Line, as had the armoured units that had been deployed northwest of us. At 7 a.m. we started the attack on Fortress Fermont and some smaller fortifications which protected Fermont in the rear and flanks. Although at the highest command echelon, there must have been precise information about even the smallest of Maginot fortifications. Down at my level, certainly, there were no precise instructions available. As the regimental pioneer platoon leader, I was not even asked to join the preliminary staff meeting. Therefore, I was also not asked if my men indeed had the necessary ordnance and other equipment to successfully breach pillboxes built from steel-reinforced concrete, as well as armoured cupolas. I think the mission was performed in haste and without any measurable chance of success. For a division with our equipment, this task was too big by a few hat sizes, and our nice old Stabsfeldwebel was not the only one who became a victim. Later I suspected that the older reserve Oberst and his adjutant did not figure out how to employ the pioneer platoon effectively. They simply forgot about us. The order given to me shortly before the attack was strictly out of embarrassment for their omission. I was ordered to send 2 groups of my pioneers to each of the 3 battalions of the regiment. After that, the regimental commander would ask me what I was planning to do. My answer, namely that I would join one of these groups, seemed to satisfy him. No one ever asked what my men were really capable of doing. Along with my group, I joined one of the battalions led by an older reserve Hauptmann. If I remember correctly, it was the 2nd Battalion of our infantry regiment 371. We removed some barbed wire and cleared out a few mines. That was all we were trained and equipped to do. We stopped short before an armoured turret with an excellent field of fire that was spraying the approaches with a machine gun. A berm on the edge of the woods about 50 metres from the turret provided us with some cover. Our preparatory bombardment, using Stukas, Czech Skoda 305mm howitzers, 210mm howitzers, 6 batteries of 105mm howitzers, and even some 88mm high-velocity anti-aircraft guns, had accomplished nothing appreciable. Now my pioneers were expected to make a difference. To attack the turret, we soon learned, was absolutely suicidal. The young company commander ordered the old Stabsfeldwebel, our former topkick, to attack the armoured turret under the cover of our fire support. For pioneers, equipped with smoke grenades, limpet mines, and eventually flamethrowers, it would have been quite possible to knock out the turret, but not without these implements. Nevertheless, the brave Stabsfeldwebel and his men sprang from cover and attacked. Within seconds, they were all dead. As the regimental commander pushed to try again, the quiet Hauptmann asked the regimental commander to personally go up front for an evaluation. After the visit, no further pressure was forthcoming. In the September 1981 issue of Alte Kameraden magazine, I found a report about the unsuccessful attack against Fortress Vermont by a battalion of Infantry Regiment 371, which was titled "Good Luck on Both Sides." The author wrote that on the 21st of June 1940, at 7 a.m., the reinforced battalion attacked the fortress. Since there was no effective support by heavy weapons, the attack was unsuccessful and was stopped around 11 a.m. The reason for the author's choice of title became obvious as I read on. On the 17th of June 1940, German Army 88mm guns fired against Block H4 of the fort, which had walls of 1.75 meters thickness and in which 3 guns were installed. After the 88s created a 1-meter wide hole in the concrete, they ceased fire. Just one more shot would have hit the ammunition stores, creating a catastrophe. And it goes on. We, on the other hand, were very lucky. For only 2 days before our attack, the French infantry was completely pulled back from the trenches. They would have had great target practice when we emerged from the woods. On the evening of the 21st of June, my pioneers returned to regimental control. One of the battalion commanders, Major Ritter, summoned me to his quarters to chew my arse. Aha, a scapegoat. In his opinion, it was only because of the inadequacy of the paltry 16 pioneers under his command that Fortress Vermont had not been taken by his battalion. One can only hope that not even he would have believed such nonsense. The attack was, to use common parlance, as useless as a goiter. On the next day, the 22nd of June, the guns were silent. A few days later, our little Oberst accepted the surrender of the Fortress Vermont from its commandant, Capitaine Daniel Aubert. Together with my colleagues from the cavalry and communications units, I visited the barracks where the defenders of Vermont were being held temporarily. They all seemed in good spirits, but in reality it was only gallows humour. Quite rightfully, they tried to convince us that we should not feel like the victors. After all, Vermont only surrendered when the rest of France capitulated. In spite of considerable losses, we did not contribute a great deal toward the victory in France. Nevertheless, good intentions and brave actions, even if not very successful, were recognized and rewarded. For my service with my pioneer platoon, I was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. But the campaign in the West would have been won, even if we had stayed in Zinten. Immediately after the conclusion of the campaign in France, the 161st Infantry Division was moved again, this time from west to east, and assembled in and around Suwalki, close to the new German-Soviet border. Suwalki bordered immediately on our East Prussian homeland and penetrated the once Polish territory like a small wedge. Even though barely 10 months had passed since the end of the war with Poland, the town had already changed significantly. The townspeople made a friendly, organized impression. There had already been established a large, well-stocked hotel restaurant called the German House. The German innkeeper seemed to advertise the quality of his cuisine with his corpulence. Our regimental commander, Oberst Neuiger, who often used quite subtle expressions, stated that if this gastronome closed his eyes, he would explode. Although Oberst Neuiger's frequent sarcasm was indeed biting, it paled in comparison to the methods of an old company commander of mine from my days as an enlisted man. Hauptmann Erwin M., or Erwin the Only, as he was known, behind his back, to his soldiers, was one of the most unforgettable men I ever met in the army. I served under him from 1932 to 1936. He was of medium build and slim, not unpleasant in appearance, with small, cold eyes and thin lips. His pallor and exceptionally thin physique led me to suspect that he might suffer from a stomach ailment, which, as I later found out, was indeed the case. He seemed to suppress the resulting pain by consuming an enormous number of cigarettes, but of course he thereby achieved exactly the opposite. His illness may have already been chronic, and certainly was one of the causes for his grumpy, icy demeanour. A Great War veteran of the Eastern Front, Irvin was happiest when he had just finished chewing someone out. He always referred to us, his soldiers, in the third person, a strange and annoying anachronism from the days of serfdom in East Prussia. For instance, Irvin would never order a soldier to run by saying, "Run, Schmidt," but rather by barking, "He is to run." My introduction to Irwin the Only was memorable. After a brief stint in the guardhouse for a minor infraction of regulations, it was my fourth and last tour in the clink since I had enlisted, I found that my company had a new commander. The Stabsfeldwebel approached the door to the commander's office, waited a moment, stretched his stately body, cleared his throat, and only then, with bowed posture, knocked modestly at the entrance. After a quick "Ja," I was pushed into the small room and stood at attention while the Stabsfeldwebel identified me to the Hauptmann as a bum just out of the stockade. The room was filled with blue smoke, and a haggard, pale human with thin, ash-blonde hair, who first did not even take notice of the sergeant's report, sat there motionless behind his desk. His eyes almost closed. He seemed to mobilize all his strength, like a guru, to be prepared for my appearance. He only got up a while later and stood before me, seething. In a boiling rage, the Hauptmann proclaimed through clenched teeth exactly what I could look forward to if I caused him to punish me just one more time. Calming as quickly as he had become enraged, he then sat down behind his desk, seemingly sated. Later on, I realized that he was always content and at ease after thoroughly chewing out someone. For almost 4 years, he would hover above me like the sword of Dionysus hung over the unfortunate Damocles. Although possessed of a similarly sharp tongue, Oberst Neuiger was infinitely more cultured and also more insightful than Irwin the Only. After the campaign in France, he had spoken to all the officers and officer aspirants. "Gentlemen," he said at that time, "you may in all confidence tighten the straps on your helmets. We have no reason to celebrate. The skirmishing in the outposts is fortunately behind us, but the war will actually begin when the big powers come into the arena." Few of us could have known how prophetic his words truly were. In civilian clothes or dressed as border officials, officers from the division continuously observed whatever happened on the Russian side of the border. It didn't take long to find out that there, too, was a well-camouflaged deployment in process. Later, during the Russian campaign, the 161st Infantry Division from East Prussia experienced all the merciless cruelty of war against an equal opponent from which it was spared during the French campaign. In August-September 1944, after the defection of the Romanian army, the 161st was destroyed like so many other German divisions. In 1964, my fraternity brother, General Major Hans Kissel, came out with a book published by Wehr und Wissen Verlag, entitled The Catastrophe in Romania. In the notes of this book, I found the story of Oberleutnant Steinmeier, commander of the 4th Battalion of the Artillery Regiment 241 of the 161st Infantry Division, written the 5th of January 1945. Oberleutnant Steinmeier marched 750 kilometers in 32 days, continuously being chased by Russian partisans. On the 23rd of September, he and his men reached our own lines. Steinmeier was killed in action on the 21st of April 1945 in Muden an der Aller. Thus was the swan song of the brave men of this East Prussian division. Late in the summer of 1940, after we had been in Suwałki for several weeks, many personnel of the 161st were sent back to the Reich to provide the cadre for other units. I remember that from the regimental staff of Infantry Regiment 371, only some of the cavalry officers and the regimental adjutant remained, in the latter case probably to break in the new commander. The adjutant was an Oberleutnant from an old Silesian noble family, who later took his own life upon discovery of his homosexual relationship with a subordinate. I learned about this only years later, through one of his cousins who went with me on a trip to Romania. Oberst Neuiger, who always showed special appreciation toward his former adjutant, which was certainly justified, never mentioned anything about this to us, even though he most likely knew of it. Probably the whole affair was highly distressing to him, because he had often enough presented this officer as a singularly fine model for the rest of us. After leaving the 161st, we travelled once more through the Reich from east to west and ended up in Ludwigslust in Mecklenburg. Here we joined the newly formed infantry regiment 677 of the 332nd Infantry Division. Ludwigslust was the residence of the former Grand Duke of Mecklenburg, who retired in 1918. Like our East Prussia, Mecklenburg was mostly thinly populated farmland, in which 60% of the land was owned by 1% of the farmers, mainly the nobility. Ludwigslust had about 14,000 inhabitants. Before World War II, it was the garrison of Cavalry Regiment 14. The commander then was Oberst, later General Major, Friedemund von Arnim. By the time we got to Ludwigslust, a reserve cavalry unit was stationed there, under the command of Oberst Freiherr von Rudder, with his adjutant, Lieutenant Graf von Bernsdorf. A career officer once told me about a little episode that supposedly happened in the officers' mess of the Riding Academy of Hanover. To receive higher education in the art of equitation, an artillery officer was once sent there, but his name lacked the von of the noble class. When at the table he took the liberty to say a few words, he was instantly rebuked by one of the cavalry officers. If someone is from the artillery and is bourgeois, one should keep his mouth shut and be ashamed of himself. Given this sort of attitude, it is understandable that at Ludwigslust, we East Prussian grenadiers were only met with the greatest suspicion. When our new, humble, commoner regimental adjutant timidly asked his noble colleague if our officers could use the officers' mess of the cavalry regiment for a social event, he was turned down out of hand. The excuse was that the cavalry mess was home to so many valuables, including gifts from the former reigning houses of Mecklenburg, that we could not be allowed entry. Our little Oberst had been born a cavalryman, had formerly served with Ulan, Lancer, Regiment 8, had married into the nobility, and was only assigned to the infantry through a misfortune. He was greatly hurt by this biased treatment by a comrade of his own branch of the army. Our Oberst called the Baron Cavalier, and asked him if, by chance, all these valuables couldn't be secured, so that we might be allowed to temporarily use the officers' club. The cavalry adjutant responded at once with extreme annoyance, since this question was sheer sarcasm. To reply in this fashion to our Oberst was a mistake, as Oberst Neuiger was at any time prepared for a quick, acerbic, and often outright biting remark. For example, we were once moved by train through a certain town. Our regimental veterinarian turned to the commander and said, "Herr Oberst, it was here in Landsberg that I earned my spurs as a vet." Oberst Neuiger's quick response was, "And in the meantime you took them off again," meaning that the vet was no longer a particularly good horseman. On another occasion, his aide-de-camp, a cavalryman like the Oberst, apologized for being late for dinner, explaining that he was just coming back from riding. Without looking up from his plate, the regimental commander responded, "Well, if you want to call what you do riding." A few days after the gentlemen from the cavalry refused us the use of their mess, Oberst Neuiger met the fellow, Lieutenant Graf von Bernsdorf, in the street and confronted him. The subject of the confrontation was not, however, the despicable way he had denied us the use of the mess, but for being out of uniform and for rendering a sloppy salute. "Would you mind buttoning up the collar of your coat, Graf von Bernsdorf?" snapped the Oberst in his best Berlin accent. "You are neither a general, nor do you wear a medal around your neck, and if you have a chance, get an education from a professional officer on how a lieutenant should salute an Oberst." Having said this, he left the dumbstruck young nobleman perplexed. Oberst Neuiger left him alone and contentedly went his way. We celebrated our social event in a nearby town, in a modern club of a Luftwaffe bomber squadron that was stationed there. They had immediately offered to help us out. Most of the female population had already been impressed by the young, highly decorated pilots of the squadron, to the disadvantage of the arrogant, old and stuffy comrades of the reserve cavalry regiment. It was obvious that even the ladies of the local nobility, including the Royal Highnesses, preferred the aviators to the cavalrymen. Unfortunately, our party, which was celebrated in combination with the pilots, did not pass without some hard feelings. One of our battalion commanders, an older major, got riled up during a disagreement with our Luftwaffe hosts. He attempted to win the argument by pulling rank, which was, of course, resented by the other pilots. We younger ones spontaneously took sides with the young Luftwaffe Hauptmann, and I probably went too far. The major later paid me back in a malicious way. The people of Mecklenburg and their Grand Duke are known to be descendants of the Slavic Obotrites, who settled in the area between the Traw and Warnow rivers after the Germans had left, in about 500 AD. In the 12th century, the prince of the Obotrites became sovereign of the German Reich, and his people embraced Christianity. In 1815, Mecklenburg became a Grand Duchy. After living in the valley of the Ahr among descendants of Roman legionaries and Western European peoples, we East Prussians became acquainted with a different sect of our German population. Unlike the lively, talkative Rhinelanders, people here seemed calmer and more circumspect. They were especially concerned with good manners, which may have been due to the presence of the Grand Duke and numerous noble court officials. Our infantrymen naturally showed special interest in the female part of the population. One could easily modify the saying about Polish women that Slavic women, in reference to the origins of the ladies of Mecklenburg, have charm beyond compare. While the girls of the Ahr Valley were dark-haired or of dark complexion, here they were mainly blonde with blue or grey eyes. If the women of the Rhineland, because of their membership in the Catholic Church, may lean toward being reserved in their conduct with men, here, in this respect, one could see joyful unconcern. To a great extent, our soldiers succumbed to the charms of these beautiful girls. Even I could not help being tempted. This temptation ultimately provided the opportunity for the old major to avenge himself in an underhanded way for my having taken sides in the Luftwaffe Pilots Club. After the French campaign, the national ban on dancing was lifted. One evening, the officers of the regimental staff proceeded to the ballroom of their favourite hangout, Prince Blücher. During the occupation by the Soviets, it was renamed Ernst Thälmann, after the communist writer. Overcoming some hesitation, even the regimental commander had joined us. Among those many girls in attendance, there were some beauties that even provoked honest compliments from our usually dour commander. He asked an especially beautiful girl several times for a dance, and it was just the one who, a few weeks later, would oversleep in my apartment. After heavy drinking, I did not succeed in getting her back on her rather nice legs. Quite miffed, her boss, who was the manager of the local post office, called up the regimental staff and reported that one of his girls was missing. He further stated that she had last been seen with an officer of our infantry regiment. Fortunately, the regimental commander was on leave, and I hoped that grass would grow over the affair by the time he returned. Of course, in farm country such as Mecklenburg, where there is grass, there are cows, and one came along to graze just as the grass began to grow. It was known in this little town that the major who had assumed command in the Ober's absence was not without sin himself, so his dressing down to me was more for my stupidity than my morality. Instead of broadcasting the matter too much, he reported every detail to Oberst Neuiger when he returned. I had to report to the regimental commander. In the eyes of the Oberst, I was an unconscionable roué, a ladies' man, who frivolously seduced the prettiest girl in the town, even after I assured him that everything was harmless, and almost all the officers of the staff had been witnesses to the fact that indeed the beautiful one had been terribly drunk. The old man didn't believe me, and, as I have to admit today, from his point of view, he was right. The young post office girl was transferred immediately to Schwerin, which, at least officially, settled the matter for her manager and for my Oberst. Shortly before the end of the war, I met her once again. She had married a physician who was at the Kurland front. I could only wish for her from the bottom of my heart that she might see him again in good health. Months before this incident, a rumour went around saying that I had been recommended for commissioning. In preparation, I had a pair of officers' riding boots made, and riding pants to go with them. One morning I was awakened by my orderly with the words, "Good morning, Lieutenant." My unsettled past prevented me from immediately being promoted to Oberleutnant, as would have been in keeping with my seniority, dating to 1935. According to this, I was the most senior lieutenant in the entire army. At lunch, in his usual way, Oberst Neuiger remarked, You look so conspicuous." From the corner of my eye, I noticed that he was carefully watching, probably to find out if I scratched the plate with my fork or even would eat peas with my knife. The regimental commander and his adjutant, by the way, in accordance with their rank, were quartered in the elegant villa of the Gräfin Baroness Voss. She was born in America and years later very kindly assisted my first wife and then 8-year-old daughter when they were refugees from East Prussia. Of course, in the months following the activation of the new 332nd Infantry Division, we worked eagerly to complete the training of our soldiers, officers and NCOs. There I noticed that our regimental commander regarded the National Socialist regime in a negative way. Shortly after the French campaign, Goebbels publicly declared Hitler the größten Feldherrn aller Zeiten, greatest field commander of all time, which in common parlance became shortened to Grofaz. One evening, when this was discussed in our temporary mess, Oberst Neuiger said in his thick Berlin accent, "Greatest commander of all times? Well, I don't know. Something like this must be learned," implying that Hitler's military education left much to be desired. I noticed his laxity about party protocols again during the sand table exercise in which all the officers of our newly established division took part, and which was directed by our Oberst. At this training event, the regimental commander had to report to the commanding general that all officers were present. According to regulations, because he was not wearing his cap, this was to be accompanied by the German greeting. Yet Oberst Neuiger simply reported with a brief bow to the general. Whether the Oberst's lack of political enthusiasm irked the commanding general, or whether it was simply a payback for his acerbic style, I cannot say. But at the sand table exercise, our Oberst took a shot in his Achilles' heel. When he inaccurately quoted some excerpts from the Holy Script of the Art of Command from Die Truppenführung, the operational doctrine manual, he was condescendingly corrected by the commanding general. Oberst Neuiger blushed like a virgin after an unseemly proposition. I have mentioned that I was embarrassed in the first inspection of my pioneer platoon because of unfavourable circumstances. Here, in Ludwigslust, I presented the regimental commander with a picture book inspection, which impressed all the guests enormously. Yet this inspection had not the least to do with our mission as pioneers. Rather, it was a parade ground-style exhibition of spit and polish. In spring 1941, the 332nd Infantry Division moved from Ludwigslust to one of the most beautiful places in France, on the Atlantic coast near Deauville. Here, our regimental commander got much more classy quarters than the ones in Ludwigslust, namely a villa of the famous perfume manufacturer, Madame Coty. The villa was situated in a magnificent park, high above the city, with a magical view of the Atlantic Ocean. To be fair, it was not only our Oberst, but all of our soldiers who had the sort of quarters in Deauville that most of us had only seen in movies. Every well-to-do Frenchman seemed to have his summer residence there. There was then no sign of the fortifications that were later built in that area, because, at that time, everyone still dreamed of going to England. Of course, we did take great notice of the preparations that were being made for such an endeavour. There was a single insignificant shiploading exercise, and that was all. The loading exercise was for Operation Celian, the code name for the invasion of England. It took place for us in the delta of a little river between Deauville and Trouville-sur-Mer. The small ship on which we were loaded induced strong suspicion regarding its seaworthiness. Additionally, one could only load at high tide because very soon afterwards, the water level in the small port would drop again, almost down to mud at low tide. I think the difference between high and low tide was around 10 metres, more or less. I was probably not the only one who was so concerned. Gross Admiral Raeder evidently shared my misgivings and those of myriad others about the practicality of this operation. With what there was for transports and warships for their protection, the German armed forces could not risk an invasion of England. The view of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, at that point, was probably already directed east, which was unfortunately confirmed by a radio bulletin we all heard on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941.